We will have the conversations that few are prepared to have, and more importantly, conversations centered on rationality. Subscribe now to listen to Rational Voices with Sunil. Thanks for joining today, William. I thought maybe a good place to start maybe is just going through the origins of the SDP.
Yeah, well, the SDP was formed in 1981. It's basically a Labour Party offshoot. In those days, it was a sort of right-wing Labour offshoot, I guess. It had a huge impact in the 80s. Probably historically, it's been the biggest challenge to the two-party system in British political history. But it didn't break through. It didn't change the voting system in the 80s. And at the end of the 80s, it got kicked back to the grassroots. The surviving party resisted the merger with the Liberal Democrats, with the Libs, because we're not Liberals, we're Social Democrats. And it started reviving and growing again about 7 years ago. So we're the modern party is a party of the conservative left, basically. That's the basic description.
I was reading a bit about yourselves and your profile, and I saw a lot of parallels, which I was quite surprised at with sort of reform at the moment, who are doing so well. Like, is that fair to say? Are there some parallels between the two similarities?
I think there are a few, but it's quite domain based. So if you're talking about, do we think we should have a border? Yes, we do. Do we think we can run our own affairs? Are we happy to leave the European Union? Yes, that's true as well. And on some of the cultural stuff, some of the woke overreach and so on, we agree with them on that. But actually, on virtually everything else, on trade policy, industrial policy, railways, housing, and so on, we're very different. So I think, to be honest, Sunil, I think the flow of information on Twitter might give people, or other social media, might give people the impression that we're closer to reform than we actually are. Because, as I say, if you look at the underlying policies we have, and I think reform are a little bit thin on policy, really, but we're quite different, and there are some fundamental things that we disagree with them on. But the disagreement wasn't enough to stop us doing a little electoral pact with reform, which we did at the last election. It wasn't a huge pact, but we did manage to agree it. But underneath that pact was the idea that we retain our independence from each other. It was just an electoral pact. So we have different ideas on the economics, basically.
Right, and I've seen you talk. One of the similarities you mentioned then was the sort of leaving the European Union, and I've seen you talk really well about the one of the things that's not really discussed a lot in media or just generally across politics is the left's reason for leaving the European Union. It's seen just generally as a more of a right-wing thing that we associate with. If you could touch on that'd be amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of a misnomer. I think, to be honest, a lot of people need to do a little bit of reading. Perhaps they wouldn't be interested in reading, but actually, post-war, Euroscepticism, EU skepticism, because obviously we're pro-European, we're Europeans ourselves, and we're very keen on the European nation states, and we're one of them. But historically, actually, Euroscepticism was quite a left-wing thing. Clement Attlee was Eurosceptic. Hugh Gates was Eurosceptic. Most Labour Party politicians were, right until the 70s or 80s, actually. In 1983, the Labour Party had a policy of withdrawing from the European Union. So it wasn't until more recent times that the Labour Party became convinced of the European Union. It was really under Blair that happened. So, yeah, I mean, philosophically, it's always been part of the left, actually, part of the left's thinking. And I've always argued that our vision of Brexit makes more sense. I think one of there are lots of issues here. I mean, I think because Brexit is so associated with Boris Johnson, people are inclined to think it's a right-wing thing. But actually remember that of the 17 plus million people that voted for Brexit, on the data, at least 5 or 6 million were on the left. So it wouldn't have happened without the left's votes on that. And so very briefly, the left-wing case for Brexit is based on, can you implement the sort of policies that you advocate? So if someone on the economic left might say, we want to nationalise the railways, we want to build some trains here, we might want to keep Port Talbot steelworks open and so on, we might have an industrial strategy. Well, I'm afraid we might have a slightly more protective trade policy, the sort of thing that Trump's arguing for and Vance is arguing for now. Well, I'm afraid if you're in the EU, you can't do any of those things because the acquis communautaire stops you. The legal apparatus, the legal architecture stops you from doing all those things. So when I debate people on the left about this, I always call them out and say, well, if you're on the left, if you're on the economic left, and you're keen on the European Union, you're keen on something which denies you the right to implement the things that you profess to want. And that's inconsistent, so it doesn't make any sense. So yeah, it was always a better case. And I think a criticism of people on the right is that you're sort of free trader type. Well, they want to get rid of the European Union, get out of that to run their own affairs. But then remember that they're all in favour of the WTO, and so they'd have to fetter their policies to another supranational organisation in there. So really, it's not nation-state democracy. So I think the right-wing case is really quite incoherent. And actually, I'd hold my hand up, and it's something I've admitted from many years back, actually, is that the Brexit coalition in Britain was itself unstable. It was an unstable coalition. People that wanted different things, you know. There were some people that were culturally pro-European, that's us, I guess, but were very hostile to the EU. There were some people that were culturally hostile to the European Union, you might say a sort of Little Englander type attitude. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but that's a different thing. And the right-wing vision is different from the left-wing one and all over the place. So it's not surprising that Boris Johnson struggled to, having convened that coalition, struggled to reconcile it. And he did, and he failed to reconcile it. And obviously the 2019 election was his high mark, and then they couldn't reconcile it. And, you know, the last year's election, they were dumped, quite rightly.
What would you look to see with the relationship with the EU now? You know, if let's say the SDP were in power, what is that relationship looking at? Because it seems, like I say, there doesn't seem to be very much clarity whether it's from the Conservatives, Labour Party. There doesn't seem. I'm not sure many people know what that relationship's going to look like. Obviously, we're predicting future, but what kind of thing would you like to see between the United Kingdom and European Union?
Well, that's a great question, and it's also a great observation because I think you're quite right. It's not, if you're not clear what the government want, I'm not either, and I suspect it's because they don't know, which is quite worrying. You know, that's very worrying. I think we want good relations, but I don't think we want to go back to any customs union or trading bloc or single market. I'm very, very critical of the single market in terms of deindustrialization. I think if you look at broadly, if you look at the trade gap, if you look at the trade balance of the UK, which has gone, basically services as a part of the economy has gone up, and we do quite well out of service exports. But manufacturing has been destroyed pretty much, and our real goods exports have failed to, the decline in the goods exports have failed to be accommodated by the services exports. So what you have is a trade gap. You're getting poorer, you're running these massive trade deficits all the time. And my basic contention is if you look at the trade gap historically, it really takes off after you're in the single market. So the single market has been something that's, I try and explain this. It's interesting economics, trying to explain it to people. I think quite a good metaphor is a boxing ring. So if you're a peripheral industrial economy in Europe, Portugal, even Italy, I guess, or Britain, you're not in the core of it, and you're in this boxing ring, the single market, you better be careful you're not knocked out by a heavyweight. And the heavyweight in European manufacturing, and it's not just goods manufacturing, things like motor vehicles that the Germans specialize in, is also actually agricultural products, finished products from the supermarkets. The French are very good at that. So if you're not in the core of that, and you have a disadvantage in industrial production and productivity against the core, you will just deindustrialize. And that's exactly what's happened. And a lot of economists have just charted this. Over the years, the periphery has deindustrialized and got poorer, and the centre has got stronger. Now, obviously, the situation that Germany's in now with losing cheap gas from Russia has affected it, and it's got its own problems. But historically, that's basically what happened. So if you think about it like a boxing ring, yes, I don't doubt that the single market increased flows, but if a flow is like a trade, if at the end of the trade you're at a loss, then it's not a good idea to contribute, to continue doing that. So my basic criticism of the EU is that the model itself is wrong, and that, I mean, we haven't even started to talk about the principal economic project, which is the euro, which is a total disaster. It's applied the wrong interest rate to the wrong country. You can't have your correct interest rate, and you also can't have the right external currency rate. So you have a lot of imbalances which are being built up in the euro system, and they're terrifying because they're trapped into it. So you look at the target 2 imbalances between Germany, the obligations that Italy has to Germany in the banking system to keep it alive, running into several hundred billions. I don't think that'll ever be paid. I think it's just a bit of a disaster. I think what you want is each country having its own currency and the currency to float on the markets, and then that allows you adaptation, and it's like a safety valve actually, really, on the markets. But they don't have that, so they have a lot of problems. So yeah, I mean, I think my main thing is just be a nation state, attend to your own affairs and trade. But I've never argued that when the sort of the deal or no deal was the main issue in 2018, 2019. I think it was the only politician in the country that was saying that no deal is better if it applies some trade friction, because at least you can start dealing with your 80, 90, 100 billion trade deficit in the EU every year. If you have some trade friction, it might be a good idea. I mean, consumers complain about it, but the politicians, the debate is wrong. So no, that's the problem. The debate is always about cheap goods, and it's never about the people that produce the goods. I'm afraid if you just go for cheap goods all the time, you'll end up with no one producing anything, and then you won't have any money to buy the cheap goods. So it's a sort of circular thing.
You touched on it there about the manufacturing implications in the UK and how much it's been on the decline. Do you ever see that changing? Do you think we'll ever have a strong manufacturing base again?
I think you could, but you've got to have. I mean, I'm not. I'm not being unrealistic about the challenge. I think the challenge is incredible. So go back to say 1980. 32, 33% of the UK's GDP was manufacturing. It's about 8 or 9 now. So it's really been hit. And actually, of the 8 or 9, remember that's the down to the knuckle. So you're dealing with, there's a lot of food manufacturing in that, the domestic market. So just food's heavy, a lot of food processing has to happen pretty much where it is if it can do. So I think we're in real trouble. My argument has always been that it won't happen if you don't have government who wants it to happen. Unfortunately, we have a government now that is not at all interested in it. We've had several governments. The Tories started this indifference to manufacturing. Tony Blair continued it. In fact, deindustrialisation was greater under Blair than it was under Thatcher. And it just continues. So, net zero is the priority. Only today, Sunil, there was a car manufacturer, a small sports car manufacturer in the Midlands. They produce less than 1,000 units a year. I think it's been running for 70 years. And the owner said, wrote a letter to the government, said, look, if we're not, are you going to allow us to produce these classic motor vehicles with engines in them or not? And the government is not clear on it. The whole factory, the whole 70 years heritage of it is put at risk because their priorities are elsewhere. So it will never happen unless you elect people that want it. But there's a whole series of other things that you need. Energy, cheap energy is probably the prime prerequisite. And again, they're more interested in net zero and electric power and banning anyone using hydrocarbons, which is mad if you're doing that at the same time as importing lots of hydrocarbons. I mean, the ONS have got a nice website, and I spend a bit of time on it looking at trade, bilateral trade between different countries. And do you know what the biggest single export from the United States to Britain is by category? Do you know what it is?
No idea.
Crude oil.
Wow.
Yeah, and and yet we have the Rosebank, crude, oil fields and gas fields west of Shetland. The government is prevaricating on exploiting. I mean, if an American government wouldn't prevaricate, it would just get it done. I mean, I've never seen the sense of not, you know, about half our trade deficit now is energy imports, which for a country like ourselves, which is got some hydro, it's got a lot of wind power now, and natural gas, coal, and oil, and oil. How have we got to a situation where we're having to import energy? And we pioneered nuclear. This country pioneered the nuclear industry and let it dwindle, and to the extent that we have to go to the Chinese or the French to ask them to build our nuclear power stations. And that's what my base case against the two parties, the Labour Party and the Tories, is that I think we've been badly misgoverned. And if you care about the country, the answer cannot be in voting for these two parties, because on the evidence they've just let it go. So I'm very critical of them on that. But yeah, energy is a prerequisite, and then you've got to want it, and then you've got to look at trade policy and industrial policy. So there's a lot in that. But I can promise you won't get it from the Tories or Labour.
Well, it's fascinating. I recently listened to Mike Baker, who's, I think, a former CIA, head of CIA at some point in one of his positions, and he talked about the importance of energy independence. He said this just before the Russia-Ukraine war, and he said that, countries in the West are, making massive mistakes in terms of they're moving away from energy independence, but they need to be pushing more towards energy independence. They need to be able to produce their own energy. If you can't produce your own energy, then you're leaving yourself open to regimes like Russia and China, and you have no choice. And it was a really fascinating listening to him. It sounds very similar to what you're saying. And talking of, you gave the example of us importing crude oil from America, and Trump, of the new president of the USA, has been quite well, been very critical of net zero and the Paris Accord. He's obviously come out of the Paris Agreement. Do you think that style of leadership could work in the UK? Because it seems he's been very effective in these first 8 days as president. Could that style of leadership work in the UK?
I think his basic offer. I mean, I'm on record as not being very sympathetic to Trump as an individual. I'm not. I don't warm to him, and I would struggle to vote for him. But I like Vance, and I like some of the people behind him in this administration. And I do have a lot of sympathy with the basic offer, which is a red-blue offer. Culturally fairly traditional, but on things like national security and trade, quite protectionist, which is associated with being left wing. But in Trump's case, I suppose it is very left wing. But I mean, naive trade, free trade purism has cost the Americans and the British huge amounts. I mean, we've had a whole generation of politicians of both Democrat and Republican, Labour and Tory, that are just their reflex is free trade purism. So they approach these things in an incredibly naive way. You mentioned the strategic or the security issue of trade, and particularly on things like food and energy. These are massively important, but also strategic industries like can you provide arms? Can you build a warship and so on? That is also very important. But on those basic things, we're just very naive. I think we've had 40 years of not caring about anything, and then all of a sudden, when a bridge goes down in Baltimore, how are we going to build it? Well, you might struggle to build it. I mean, they will get it done, but we've deindustrialized so much. We're so reliant on China in particular. It's actually dangerous, and it's not just, as I say, it's not just manufacturing. If you look at food supply, in 1980, about 85% of our calories were produced here, by British farmers. And in fact, you could survive on that. I mean, there's a lot of food waste in houses, and there's a lot of food waste on farms. So if push comes to shove, you could probably feed yourself. We're miles away from that now. We're really struggling, down at 60% and falling. And of course, the population's going up, and it's projected to go up to 72, 73 million. That is, if they know how many people are in the country, which they probably don't. So yeah, I think the present generation of politicians is just blindsided by suddenly the clunk of industry lost. Can't feed yourself. If anything happened, you know, um, in a serious conflict, and Britain would be quite exposed. That's my point. So I think Trump is quite right to look at these things. I think to compare, you have to be realistic. It's no good living in a fantasy world. Trump, strategically, and certainly in terms of energy, the United States is in a supreme position, produces basically all it needs, and it actually exports. So Trump is in a very good position to apply tariffs punitively and for trade, but punitively to states that are not cooperating on various things. I don't think Britain has that much power. I don't think we are in the same position. You've got basically America as a whole continent of resources, and they're much better placed to be an autarky. I mean, if they really wanted to be an autarky, basically feed themselves and look after themselves. I don't think Britain's in that position, but you've got to have a government that's aware of it and tries to improve the situation gradually in our favour. And I just don't see any government doing that. In fact, I think things are getting worse.
You mentioned there about the rising population in terms of when, in particular, it's coming from essentially migration. We know there's declining birth rates across the UK, so it's coming from a mass number of migration. When has this become such in your opinion, such a political topic? Because I've seen videos of even Tony Blair and Barack Obama, like these people talk about the fact that they want to control the borders and they need to have strategic places in place to stop illegal immigrants coming in. But it seems now it's become really, really politicized. When, in your opinion, did this become so politically motivated for the basic thing of just wanting to control your borders?
I think mass immigration has always been quite a hot topic. You only have to go back sort of post-war in Britain in the 60s, late 60s, Powell, cultural change, demographic change. It was an issue in the 70s politically. It was fringe parties that dealt with it, really. The mainstream parties tended not to focus on it very much. I think the main change on the data is when Blair got in, and in particular, invited the new applicants to the European Union from the East and Balkans to have free flow in the labour market. And this is something that they most famously, there was a government advisor that was very keen on multiculturalism and diversity, and we wanted to rub the right nose in it. That was the term that they actually used. But the estimates that the Blair government had on migrants from Romania, Bulgaria, and the Czech Republic, and so on, Poland, were that maybe 10,000 or so would come. In fact, obviously hundreds of thousands came, and over years that turned into millions. Now, a lot of those migrants are very good and quite well trained, but the argument I've always used is, and I think it's true, is that if you're too reliant on migration to fill skills gaps, it doesn't give you any incentive to train British citizens of any background or age right the way through the country. So kids leaving schools need a route to vocational training. They don't go to university. I think too many people go to university, but if they don't, they need to be given skills rapidly. So literally we'll train you up for this or that. But instead, we don't do that. We just rely on importing people. And as I say, I'm not knocking some of the immigration was very good and probably short term quite beneficial. But I think we've got some very good people, but it didn't do the British worker any good, and I think it did depress wages because on the economics that's got to happen. And meanwhile, we end up now with about 9 million adults out of the workforce and about 5.5 million on various out of work benefits, largely to do with illness. So not a good situation. And I think looking at how the labour market works nationally, I think it's been too open. I don't think it's been in our interest for it to be open. I'm against very open labour markets. I think a lot of economic liberals are very in favour of it, don't really care about it. People like Liz Truss, they've changed their tune a wee bit recently, but even Kemi Badenoch, who has changed her tune a bit recently, were quite passionate in favour of very high levels of migration if the economy wanted it. So their focus was just on what the short-term needs of business was, but they didn't think about the workers they were leaving behind here, who I think about a lot, particularly regionally. Some of the regions, the Midlands and the North, have really done quite badly out of this. and also didn't think about the cultural change, which is the thing that most politicians don't want to talk about at all.
I think what's interesting there, you talked about Midlands and other parts of the UK not doing so well from this, but I think with this such high levels of migration, as well as London had been doing or was doing as an economic power, we can now directly see the implications of such a massive demographic change and the real negativity towards that. Do you think going, in terms of solution based, what kind of migration would you like to see the SDP? What would be the sort of structure, if you like, when it comes to migration?
I think if your starting point is 9 million adults out of the workforce, I think mass migration's off the table, and I
Right.
think the government's got to try and get people, your fellow citizens, into work somehow, even if it takes a bit of time, and even, by the way, if there are some bumps in the road and friction along the way. So you've got to be prepared, if you do this, to have spikes in labour market turbulence. You might have issues with lorry drivers and other trades, or fruit pickers, or people in manufacturing, or nurses, whatever. You've got to be prepared to go through some of that. I mean, care workers is a great example where care workers are just not paid enough. I mean, you pay them X, and then you have to import a lot of people to do that work. But in fact, they should just be paid more. And I think I've always argued that British people will work if it's in their interest to do that, and if they can have a household budget that sort of works on that wage. So I want wages to go up. Yeah, the broad policy. But then again, you've got to have be prepared for the country to benefit from selective migration, and also there is migration associated with people getting married, for instance. I'm in a category myself, and so there'll always be some migration. But I think the model, what I'm arguing against, is the sort of unthinking mass migration model. Let's not bother training it. If you look at something like the NHS, let's not bother training enough doctors, nurses, clinicians, and other staff. Just ship them in. And I think the shipping in thing is very bad. It's bad economically and harmful culturally, probably, almost certainly.
You mentioned 9 million people out of work, and we've discussed this previously on this show with other guests. And I think one of the things that's really fascinating is the sort of how many are unwell. So how many are mentally unwell, and the people have talked to us. But there's a difference between having mental health issues and mental well-being, and I think some people maybe are being almost miscategorized into having mental health issues rather than just not being mentally, it should be more of a mental well-being issue rather than actual mental health. Do you see that as an issue? Do you see a lot of people taking some of this who put into this category of the mental health, or we've almost gone a bit too far now, and those people are just not essentially working?
Yeah, I think there's two things there. I think there probably is some over diagnosis and over medicalization of it. I think in the past, if someone was a bit down, they were a bit down. Um, Now we tend to to put a diagnosis on it, but but that's not to say that I think we don't have a form of crisis. I really do. I think we do have a crisis, and you only have to look at the numbers in terms of young people, um, in terms of the number of people that um, are diagnosed as having some form of mental complaint, and it's up to a third, and certainly in some of the universities, 40% of undergraduates seek some help in some universities, in the 3 years that they're there. So there's obviously something happening which has changed the stability of society. I think the obvious candidate, the obvious thing that we have lost is religion. I think the loss of your principal belief system, a belief system that bound people together and gave people a sense of solidarity and brotherhood, actually. You can't dismantle that totally and have it collapse and have it have no effect on society. I think I was doing the hustings in Leeds University during the 2019 election. I was against Hilary Benn in that election, and the student at the student hustings at Leeds University asked what we were going to do for her mental health issues. And of course, I answered. I think I can't remember exactly what I said, but the obviously mental health services are important and so on, and we've got to have the resources to support it. But in truth, the true answer, the true response should have been, have you considered going to church? And I think had I said that, I probably would have been the response from the questioner might have been negative. But I'm saying that in all seriousness, in that if you had a spiritual need in the past, it wouldn't have been odd at all for you to go to your local rector about it, or just to attend church and deal with it maybe in that way. Um, and I in it, I mean, I always encourage people to attend, whether they believe or not. And I personally don't believe, but I do attend quite a lot, and I enjoy it. And I get a lot out of it spiritually. But I don't. I'm not a believer. But that's at the core of it. And I don't. There isn't a. It's one of these things where no politician is going to be able to click their fingers and say, "Well, that's the answer." But I'm just saying we have no chance if we don't think about the causes properly. It's like the it's like the cause of a lot of crime or antisocial behaviour or kids running riot or kids failing in academically or taking drugs or whatever. I think a lot of that is downstream of the breakdown in the traditional family. I mean, mum and dad, traditional family, being there for the kids for the whole of their lives through thick and thin. Now, I mean, I'm not saying, again, on that topic, I'm not saying that you can click your fingers and solve it overnight, but you're not going to solve anything if you're not serious about the causes. And, suddenly you'll have heard a lot of debate on the BBC and other places where they'll deal with something like knife crime or I don't know, housing or whatever. They never talk about anything. They never talk about serious causes. They just flick around at the superficial level. So, as I say, I think if you are going to look at it in a really macro way, a society that's lost has discharged itself from its principal belief system and has become post-religious is going to have some trouble, and I think that's at the root of a lot of it.
It's interesting because, again, on here we've talked about the impact of two-parent households and how arguably the best privilege you can have in whether it be United Kingdom, America, Brazil, wherever it's having two parents, having a father and a mother. It doesn't matter where you're born, your skin color, wherever you're at a significant advantage if you have a mum and dad versus just a mum or just a dad. And the differences are really, really stark in terms of economic poverty, likely to go to jail, like literacy rates, almost on every scale, it's a lot worse off. Yeah.
Yeah, everything, crime, everything, virtually every metric you're talking about is better with family stability. Yeah, true.
When did it become unfashionable to talk about this? Because talking about this, it's not going to be, again, the most fashionable conversation. When did this change where, again, it's also been a bit politicized, you could argue, with families, well, it feels like if it's been politicized. When did that exactly change? And why have we seen such an almost a celebration of the destruction of a basic nuclear family?
I think it's just downstream of '60s, '50s, and '60s liberalism, social liberalism, and my basic criticism of politics and how the country's been run generally is most of it goes back to the double liberalism we've lived under, social and economic liberalism at the same time, which has been like getting shot by both sides, really. Yeah, and I think it is. I mean, I think when people talk about the '60s and the liberal revolution of that time, um, sometimes not enough emphasis is put on how many deep roots these ideas had. I mean, certainly if you look at if you look at the Bloomsbury Group or any progressive, particularly in the arts, if you look at their attitudes in the 1920s, 30s, all of these ideas were in there then. Anti-establishment, anti-patriarchy, anti-tradition, anti-nation. It's all there. So it goes back a long way, but it really takes off then. And then it just becomes rampant individualism. It's me, me, me. There are lots of ways of describing it. It's like the L'Oreal advert, because I'm worth it. So it's all about me, me, me. And so you get rid of the idea of duty and thinking about other people, and it's just about self-actualization. How can I make my own way in the world and forget about everyone else? So yeah, it's shedding duty. Actually a lot of, particularly some very good American writers like Christopher Lash, talks about the abolition of shame. So pursuit of individual rights and you putting your own interest first all the time. There's a sort of sense in which there's no shame. You do what you like. You abolished shame. Shame used to control people's actions. To do something selfish was shameful. It's not really anymore. So it's very difficult to turn things around. And in some respects, you're not actually looking to turn things back necessarily. You want to go forward. You've got to deal with the world we live in. But I refuse uh, to to argue for positions that are not based on evidence. And I want to be honest. I think there's a searching for honest politics, and what we try and do in the SDP is to be courageous on all of these topics, actually, but argue from a good faith position. But just sorry on the data, mum and dad raising up their kids is better for the kids and for society, wider society. But that's not. I think that to answer your question a little bit more, I think one of the reasons why it's been difficult to do that is that the crude, superficial way that you're dealt with if you argue these things, particularly on a sort of thin. I mean, it's nice to chat to you over an hour, because we can actually get into it. But but in a 3-minute interview, if you say, traditional family, you'll just be people will immediately say, well, you're being awful to single parents or whatever, and that's not at all. And actually, a lot of people didn't start out to be single parents. The pressure on young families now, particularly when they're starting on housing, jobs, 2 incomes, 1.5 incomes, or whatever, everyone's knackered, puts pressure on them that previously perhaps wasn't there. If housing was cheaper, you'd have more family stability. So there's a lot in that. And a lot of people are single parents through just misadventure. It's like something tragic happens. So, and it's not to say that there aren't some absolutely fantastic single parents. It's also not to say that you're probably better off with a great single parent than an awful, fighting 2 parents. But those are the exceptions. I'm talking about the population level. It is just the case that family stability with mum and dad there raising the kids is better for the kids in society. And I'm sorry, that's where the facts are. And if that's where they are, that's what public policy should support.
I think again the facts support this, but talking of the religious aspect is really interesting because we're obviously a lot less religious as a country than we've probably ever been. But I always feel like we see religious like behavior still from people, whether it's I'd argue a lot of the Just Stop Oil people are almost religious in the way they act, and you see it in other pockets of society and other fringe groups like this. BLM, you could argue, became almost quite religious and almost cult-like in some ways. What role can religion play now going forward? Because, like I say, we're less and less people have faith, less and less people are religious, and how damaging do you think the fact that we have become less of faith as a country has had an impact on the overall country?
Oh, I think it has. Yeah, I think it's been devastating. Apart from anything else, your national culture was Christian, and if you're post-Christian, it has deep, profound impacts on what your national culture is. The norms that you take, the things that people accept and expect of themselves and other people, all changes in a post-religious environment. And again, you've got to be realistic. You can diagnose the loss, but it's not. You can't click your fingers and force people to become religious again. I think it's going to be a real challenge. One observation I do have about this is that a society that is in this situation of adaptation and transition from away from a religious foundation to one that's post-religious and individualistic, it's a pretty lethal thing to do to import millions of people from an alternative culture that is very, very sure of their religious position and don't have this at all. So the Muslim population of Britain doesn't have any doubts, really, or a lot of people don't. It's a very strong, very high conviction. And if you compare the conviction of of that community, and to some extent the in-group solidarity that exists in that community with the sort of looseness and post-religious doubt that exists in the mass society, I think it's very dangerous for the obvious reason that lots of different people are coming to live in Britain from lots of different places. And if the core, central, majority culture, whatever that is unsure of itself, then it can't set any cultural tone. And it actually makes it very difficult for people to say, well, this is where we are in the society. So it's a really awkward, quite an unnerving situation because, as I say, the cultural elites that we have are either keen on denigrating our history, attacking itself, undermining Western civilization, or just don't have any conviction in it and won't set any norms. So it almost invites minority groups to say, okay, well, you're not very confident about what you're about, so I'll step up and it's going to be our way. So I think that's what you get. So that's quite uncomfortable. I think it's true what you say, and a lot of writers have covered this. The parallels between what people call, I like to call progressive ideology, and religion, and I think they're quite well made. I think there's a lot of Christianity in ultra progressive positions. The quest for equality, the quest for justice, I think actually individual rights also have strong Christian roots. But as others have commented, it's an awful situation because what you have in wokery and progressive ideology now is a lot of that stuff, but without any of the redemption or forgiveness. So that part would be useful, wouldn't it?
Well, I think that's a really good point because once if you get counseled by these groups, then that's essentially it. You're almost thrown to the wolves, and that's the end of it.
Yeah.
You've talked a lot about the failures of liberalism. How much of that can you almost attribute to the changing demographic of the UK? How much of an impact has that had? We're obviously seeing net migration in crazy high numbers, both under Labour and Conservative governments. How much of an impact has that had?
I don't think it's had a negative impact. I think, if anything, some of the cultural attitudes of some migrant groups are probably quite helpful. Um, I think, I think the cause of the mass migration is liberalism of various kinds, But I don't think if you look at, it's fascinating. For instance, I'll give an example. So the great liberalisation in the 60s, it was my predecessor as leader of the SDP, although he wasn't leader, but the first leader of the SDP was Roy Jenkins. When he was Home Secretary under Labour in the 1960s, 1967, he got the act through to legalise homosexuality. That was after the Wolfenden report. So it's part of the great liberalisation. Now, as an issue, something like homosexuality, in terms of the British Social Attitudes Survey and what people generally think in Britain, we'd regard it as a done thing. It's in the bag, right? No one's really contested, nor should they. But actually, if you look at attitudes among Britons now, one of the most homophobic places in Britain is London, and it's
Wow.
because it has quite high immigrant groups who just don't have the same liberal attitude on this. So perhaps I picked the wrong example because I think some of the attitudes that some immigrant groups have on family life are probably more have better foundations and are more grounded, really. But you get my point. It's not. I think mass immigration comes from liberal attitudes of white progressives here. I don't think. I think that the cultural effect of mass immigration is various. But in put it crudely, there are more. The churches are fuller now as a result of migration. So a lot of these things you can be optimistic or pessimistic. It depends what thing you're talking about.
What sort one of the things we've had reoccurring here is on the show previously is like the identity for Britain, what Britain's identity should be, what it should look like. And you've alluded to it, and you've touched on it a bit with the sort of the Christian aspect of Britain. What else do you think is really important for Britain in terms of its its cultural and social identity, aside from just the Christian side?
I don't. Yeah, I mean, I think the Christian side is underrated because people, as a post-Christian society, people um, miss the links. Because the link is broken, so they don't attend church. So they think their fundamental attitudes and responses to things are come from thin air or something. They don't realise how Christian it is. People like Tom Holland, have written about this extensively. I mean, the whole of the belief system is basically Christian, or of Christian, of Christianity. But I think, I mean, it's a raging debate, isn't it, Sunil? People say, if someone like Blair, someone like New Labour says, you come here, you've got to accept British attitudes. And then they're asked, what are British attitudes? And they just reel off a load of liberal cliches: diversity is strength, tolerance, respect for others, all this sort of thing. Well, they might be, but they didn't used to be always. And actually, technically, British culture is whatever Britons are doing at the time. That's just, as a philosopher, I would say that's how you define it. So, to go back to an issue like homosexuality, in the 1800s, there was no doubt at all that to 90% of people thought it was wrong, punishable. They had no doubt about that because it came straight from Leviticus 18:22, or whatever their source was. Now, the country's completely changed its view on that. So you can't say that attitude is a British thing, because it was different, right? It changes. So I think I take a slightly um, looser look at it. And to be honest, I think it's more about the pub. It's more about British people have English people particularly, because there are differences actually in the regions and throughout England and to Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, but Northern Ireland. But English people in particular have a sort of a high sense of rights. They have a high degree of embedded rights. They have an idea that they have a right to speak, or a right of general fairness. And I think it's a reasonably, historically, recently, it's been a reasonably uncorrupt society compared to others. I think all of these things you say, well, you say this, but you've got to compare it to something. No society is free of corruption. So there are certain sort of traits or characteristics which I think you'd argue are associated with Englishness or Britishness, and it's like that. But I'm never I don't I've never been very keen on people getting a sort of a list of things that they like and then just saying that's what the British are like, or that's what the. I don't think it works like that. I think the English are like what they are at the time, and it does change. As the philosopher John Gray famously said, philosophers' views on moral attitudes are like the fashion in hats; they change.
Well, it's one of the things that I've read recently, and it'll be interesting to get your view on this, is on this sort of British identity and the Britain's role on the world. And one of the things was how we're not educated or talked a lot about is how much Britain changed post World War II, or post the British Empire collapse, where no longer Britain were this superpower, and it was almost replaced by the United States of America being that new superpower. And I've seen people have different views on this in terms of what Britain's relationship with the US should be like. So I've heard some people say we should almost look at America as like the big older brother and take components of where it's been very successful, and maybe not take some of the points that are not so good in America. Where do you stand on that, especially now with America seeming like they're on a really positive approach going forward?
You could take some. It's a difficult question because so much of American, certainly political culture, is English actually.
Mm.
So the founding, uh, the philosophical foundations of John Locke, basically, or Thomas Hutchison, who was Scots, I think. But you're the founding fathers were just writing an English or British set of rights to assert what I said before, what they felt their embedded rights were as a free people. That's the whiff of that's the kernel of what it was about. Not all societies had that. Not all societies had this idea of uh, property rights, individual rights, and could set them down in a constitution in that way. So I think that's very English. I think the interesting about the United States is it's becoming less English. It's becoming less Anglo, less waspy, as the term they use. And it'll be interesting to see what survives of that. I think as the culture, as the components change of the country itself, it might become more of a sort of a mix, actually. So you can always learn. I think I don't know. I think there are aspects. Part of my family is Australian. Whenever I go there, you can see very big similarities. Particularly in the hinterland in Australia, between hinterland Australia and hinterland Britain. You can see walk into a pub or a cricket club and just pretty much see the different sets of Anglo-Celtic people doing different things. Usually walking in with their cricket whites on, having had a bat or whatever. So I think you can recognise it across the world. But I think I think things change. I think you can lose. I'm very concerned about obviously the broad direction the country is going in, but I think the it's the biggest issue is the us thing, which I talk about a lot, which is the who are we? Are we prepared to share with each other? And the thing that concerns me with ideas like multiculturalism or individualism is that I just don't. If you're not in it together, you won't get any sharing. If you don't get the sharing, then we really are at war with each other, and you're not living in a society that is us. So I've always been pretty clear about my nationalism because I think nationalism um, is the only thing that combine people of different backgrounds and ideas together under a single state and sort of look after each other. Really.
How do you change that kind of individualistic society? There's no doubt. I think the younger generations, probably my generation and younger for sure, have a much more individualistic mind frame than previous generations, and it's probably now changing even in older generations. It definitely seems like there's a lot more strong individualism. How do you change that and make that more of a collective society? Because it seems very difficult to do, especially in some ways, even maybe even harder now with the internet and social media.
Yeah, I think it's well, social media. Well, we can talk about that. I think some of it's self-correcting in that I think sometimes these social um, movements are experimental, if you like. I think sometimes the society just goes in a particular direction, and I think it can self correct if the nostrums or the culture or the ideas that the thing is based on just have very poor foundations, or what philosophy would say, poor correspondence to reality. So I think for instance, if you can see that um, uh, liberal individualism makes people unhappy, and that actually helping other people makes you happier, or considering other people makes you happier, then I think actually it can be an experiment that can actually self-correct. I think sometimes, again, a lot of these things are in cycles, so there is some evidence. It's quite early stage yet, but there's still some evidence that the younger generation, not millennials, that is it Generation Z, I think.
Maybe
Anyway,
Z, yeah.
yeah, the young, sort of 18 to 25-year-olds are, coming out all traditional and rejecting the liberal ideas that perhaps their parents or their teachers or certainly the university lecturers would have tried to have them imbibe. And the most revolutionary thing you could do is to be a sort of traditional conservative and aspire to have a marriage that is, you have fidelity and you have duty to other people. Perhaps that's the most revolutionary thing you could do nowadays. But if people want to do that, I think they would be happier.
What sort of, as we're sort of looking to round up, what are the STB plans? Like, what are the plans going forward? Obviously, there's a long way till the next general election. What are some of your plans and the party's plans in the build up towards that?
Good question. Yeah. So it's not. I've always been very honest publicly about how difficult it is to get a party. I mean, the party has, as we said at the start, has an incredible position in British politics historically. You know, and it is actually quite an old party now. It's older than Reform or the Lib Dems and so on. But it did go to virtually nothing. I mean, it went to about 70 members in 2018. So it was tiny. It was literally knocked back to nothing, ready to sort of fade away. So going from that to growth to 20 candidates in 2019 and then 122 in last year's election is great growth. One of the first things I wanted to do was to win some elections. So we did what the Greens do. Inevitably, a growing party will do this: is focus on an area where you concentrate on, you get some good candidates and good campaigning capabilities, and that's been in Leeds, Leeds City Council. We've won elections 3 years running, but it took a few years to win the first one. You know, so honestly, it's very rough. You've got very large constituencies, and you're up against parties with more resources, so it takes time. But in general, we're just going to build it up, and we're fortunate in having a clear run. Really, the top left corner of the political quadrant is us. There's no one else in there. So if you like the conservative left, if you take a more patriotic view on economics and you don't want your utilities sold off to foreign entities to milk and laden with debt, and you think the railways should be run as great British railways for the British people and so on, you want British nuclear power. But you also think the market is best for running most goods and services, and you believe in the family, then all of those things, it's the same as immigration. We want to end mass immigration, have selective migration, start training your own people. Most British people agree with the SDP on most things. So all we're going to do is build it up to the next election and get the very best result we can.
Amazing. Well, we have like a closing sort of ritual on this show, and we do it to all of our sort of guests, and it's a really simple one. So it can be something that we've discussed already. It can be trivial, but essentially it is what is an unpopular opinion that you have that you think should be popular. It can be, like I said, something that we've discussed already. It can be completely trivial, but an unpopular opinion that you have that you think should be popular.
I think I don't know if it's an unpopular opinion, but people don't talk about it very much. So the thing I think is very important is civilized toleration of differences. You hear a lot of people in a society as diverse as us constantly arguing for equality, and I would agree with that. Right, you aim for equality as much between citizens as you can, but in a diverse society, you've got to respect the flip side of a free society, which is that, wait for it, different groups will do different things in different domains. And so I would say, if you're honest, you've got to face up to the fact that in some areas, some groups are going to outperform others. And if the society is going to work, you really have to treat that with a degree of civilized toleration and be grown up about it, instead of saying that's outrageous. We ought to correct that by pulling these people down or pushing these. No, you've just got to aim for equality and aim for impartiality, but understand that a diverse society will have different outcomes, actually, for different groups sometimes.
Perfect. Well, thank you for your time, William.
It's been a real pleasure, Senel. Thank you. Cheers.